On a frostbitten morning in December 1863, as dawn broke over the cotton fields of Phillips County, Arkansas, a piercing silence cloaked the Mississippi Delta. The Civil War raged far beyond these lands, but here, the old order of slavery held firm, its chains as unyielding as the icy ground. In this world of whips and cotton, Wes Bogan, an enslaved black man, stood outside a wooden house, his scarred hands gripping an axe. For years, he had endured the lash of Monroe Bowen, his master, whose cruelty was as relentless as the sun that scorched the fields. Humiliation, beatings, and mocking words had carved deep wounds into Wes' soul, yet he carried a fire no chain could extinguish. That morning, as the first light crept across the frost, Wes raised his axe, shattering the silence with a single, defiant strike. This is not just the tale of violence, it's the story of a man pushed beyond endurance, whose act of rebellion challenged a system that sought to erase his humanity. Join us as we uncover Wes Bogan's heart-wrenching journey, a story of pain, defiance, and the unyielding quest for dignity in a world that offered none. In the heart of Phillips County, Arkansas, where the Mississippi Delta stretched under an unforgiving sun, Wes Bogan's life unfolded in the brutal grip of slavery. The year was 1863, and though the Civil War tore through distant battlefields, the cotton fields of Monroe Bowen's plantation remained a world unto themselves, ruled by the crack of whips and the weight of chains. Wes, a black man born into bondage, knew no other reality. His days began before dawn, when the air was still heavy with the chill of night, and ended long after the stars pierced the sky. The plantation was a machine that devoured time and spirit alike, its fertile soil yielding white cotton that stretched like snow across the horizon. But for Wes and those like him, the land's beauty was a cruel illusion, masking a life of relentless toil. Their cabins were little more than wooden shells, wind whistling through cracks in winter, heat suffocating the dirt floors in summer. Food was scarce, a handful of cornmeal or a scrap of pork fat if they were lucky. Sleep was a fleeting visitor, interrupted by the ache of hunger or the dread of the next day's labor. Every sunrise brought the same command: work, from dawn's first light to dusk's final shadow. Wes' existence was reduced to a line in Monroe Bowen's ledger, his name barely a whisper in a world that saw him as property. To the overseers, he was invisible, a pair of hands to pick cotton, a back to bear the lash. His body told the story of his life, calloused hands that bled from thorny stems, shoulders hardened by years of hauling loads, a back crisscrossed with scars from whips that struck without reason. Each mark was a testament to a system that profited from his pain, where cotton was weighed, sold, and celebrated, while the man who harvested it was erased. The plantation's rhythm was unrelenting. Dawn meant fields, noon meant exhaustion, night meant collapse on a rough pallet, only to rise again before the sun. Overseers barked orders, their boots stomping the porch with a cadence that spelled fear. Every sound, every creak of wood, every snap of a whip, was a reminder of the power that bound him. Wes learned early that to survive, he had to be silent, to move swiftly, to keep his eyes low. But silence was not surrender. It was a shield, a way to protect the spark of humanity that no lash could extinguish. Beneath the weight of his chains, Wes carried a truth that set him apart from the ledger's cold calculations. He was a man, not a beast, not a tool, not a shadow. This knowledge burned quietly within him, a fire fed by every insult, every blow, every moment he was forced to bow. To those who claimed ownership, he was nothing, a figure to be worked until broken. But Wes saw himself differently. In the fleeting moments of rest, when the fields were quiet and the stars offered a rare glimpse of something beyond the plantation, he felt the weight of his own existence. His hands, though scarred, were his own. His heart, though heavy, still beat with purpose. This inner conviction was dangerous, a secret he guarded as carefully as a smuggler hides contraband. To acknowledge his humanity was to defy the system that sought to erase it, and Wes nurtured this defiance in the quiet corners of his soul, where no overseer could reach. The anger that simmered within Wes was not loud or reckless. It was a slow burn, a coal pressed deep into the core of his being. Every lash that tore his skin, every command that stripped his dignity, added fuel to this hidden fire. He learned to wear his silence like armor, to let the world see only obedience while his mind churned with the weight of injustice. The overseers mistook his bowed head for submission, but they were blind to the storm building inside him. Each day he endured, each insult he swallowed, was a deliberate act of survival, a choice to wait for a moment that might never come. West's life was a testament to endurance, but it was not without cost. The scars on his back were matched by those on his spirit, each one a reminder of the humanity he refused to surrender. In the fields, under the watchful eyes of men who saw him as less than nothing, West carried a quiet resolve, a belief that one day, his silence would give way to a voice that could not be ignored. In the heart of Phillips County, Arkansas, where cotton fields stretched like a white sea under the 1863 sun, Monroe Bowen ruled his plantation with the iron grip of a man who believed himself untouchable. To the enslaved men and women who toiled under his command, he was more than a master. He was a tyrant, the living embodiment of a system that thrived on their suffering. His presence cast a shadow over every cabin, every furrow of earth, his polished boots and silver-buckled belt symbols of a power that demanded absolute submission. Monroe's cruelty was not just a tool of control, it was a performance, a ritual he relished. His laughter, sharp and cutting, carried the weight of a whip, and his voice, heavy with scorn, could silence a room with a single word. The creak of his boots on the wooden porch was a sound that froze hearts, a warning that pain was never far away. For West Bogan, an enslaved man whose life was reduced to a line in Monroe's ledger, this cruelty was a daily reality, a relentless assault on his body and soul that left scars no one could see but everyone could feel. Monroe's tyranny was as calculated as it was brutal. He didn't need to wield his whip often. His reputation did the work for him. When he did, each lash was a statement, a reminder that he held the power to wound, to break, to destroy. West was a frequent target, not because he defied orders, but because Monroe seemed to take pleasure in singling him out. "Move faster, beast," he'd bark, his voice dripping with contempt as he stood over West in the fields, the sun glinting off his belt buckle like a mocking star. A shove here, a strike there, sometimes with the flat of his hand, sometimes with the handle of his whip. The blows weren't always hard enough to draw blood, but they were always meant to degrade, to remind West that he was nothing more than property. Monroe's words were just as sharp, each one a blade designed to cut deeper than leather. He called West names that stripped away manhood, words that turned a person into a thing: beast, meal, filth. Each insult landed like a physical blow, embedding itself in West's memory, a wound that festered long after the bruises faded. The worst of Monroe's cruelty unfolded in front of others, as if he needed an audience to complete the act. When visitors came to the plantation, their carriages rolling up in clouds of dust, Monroe would summon West like a showman displaying a prize animal. "Look at this one," he'd say, gesturing at West with a grin that hid venom. "Strong as an ox, dumb as dirt." The visitors would laugh, their chuckles a chorus that echoed across the fields, each note tightening the knot in West's chest. In the marketplace or on the plantation's front porch, Monroe turned West's existence into a spectacle, pointing and mocking as if his humanity were a joke to be shared. Children, imitating their elders, would giggle and repeat the slurs, their voices high and cruel in their innocence. Women hid smirks behind their fans, and men nodded approvingly, as if West's degradation was a mark of Monroe's strength. These public humiliations were not just personal, they were a ritual of power, a way for Monroe to prove his dominion not only over West but over everyone who watched. Each laugh, each jeer, was a chain forged anew, binding West to a system that saw him as less than human. Through it all, West endured with a silence that belied the storm within him. His face remained impassive, his eyes fixed on the ground, but his heart burned with a fury he dared not show. Every slap, every mocking word, was a spark added to a fire he kept buried deep. Monroe mistook the silence for weakness, a sign that West was broken, tamed. But he was wrong. West's endurance was not surrender, it was survival, a deliberate act of will that preserved the ember of defiance no whip could extinguish. Each insult he swallowed, each blow he absorbed, was a choice to wait, to bide his time in a world that offered no mercy. The scars on his back told one story: but the fire in his soul told another. In the quiet of the night, when the plantation slept and the stars bore witness, West nurtured that fire, knowing that one day it might consume the silence he had carried for so long. Monroe's cruelty was a weight, but it was also a forge, shaping West into a man whose patience was not weakness, but a weapon waiting to be wielded. In the endless expanse of Phillips County, Arkansas, where cotton fields shimmered under the 1863 sun, West Bogan carried a burden heavier than the bales he hauled. Each day on Monroe Bowen's plantation was a crucible, forging scars that ran deeper than the skin. West's back bore the jagged marks of countless lashes, each one a brutal reminder of a system that saw him as less than human. His hands, rough as leather from years of pulling thorny cotton, ached with the memory of relentless labor. But the wounds that cut deepest were not those that bled. They were the invisible ones, carved by the relentless cruelty of Monroe Bowen, whose mocking words and public humiliations pierced West's soul like a blade. Every scar on his body told a story of survival, but every insult etched into his heart told a story of endurance pushed to its breaking point. In the quiet of the night, when the plantation slept, West lay awake, his eyes tracing the rough beams of his cabin's ceiling, the weight of those wounds pressing against his chest like a stone. The pain was not just physical, it was a constant erosion of his dignity, a theft of the man he knew himself to be. Monroe's cruelty was not a fleeting act but a daily ritual, a routine designed to grind West into submission. In the fields, under the watchful eyes of overseers, or in the dusty yard where neighbors gathered, Monroe made a spectacle of West's degradation. "Look at this mule," he'd sneer, his voice carrying across the crowd, drawing laughter from those who saw West as nothing more than property. He'd call West forward, not to work but to be mocked, his strong frame reduced to a prop in Monroe's display of power. "Good for labor, nothing else," he'd say, pointing as if West were livestock at a market. The crowd's chuckles, from children parroting slurs to men nodding in approval, were a chorus that tightened the noose around West's spirit. Each word was a deliberate cut, meant to strip away his manhood, to remind him that in this world, his worth was measured in cotton, not humanity. Even in moments of rest, when West might have found a sliver of peace, Monroe's voice would find him, sharp and inescapable, a reminder that humiliation followed him like a shadow. The plantation was a stage, and West was its unwilling performer. Monroe's taunts were not confined to private moments. They were public, meant to be seen, to reinforce the hierarchy that kept West in chains. When visitors arrived, their boots kicking up dust as they surveyed the fields, Monroe would parade West before them, his laughter a weapon as sharp as his whip. "Strong as an ox, dumb as dirt," he'd say, his grin wide as he gestured at West, who stood silent, his eyes fixed on the ground. The visitors' laughter, their casual nods, were salt in the wound, each one a reminder that West's pain was entertainment. Children, too young to understand the cruelty, mimicked the slurs, their high-pitched voices echoing Monroe's venom. These moments were not just attacks on West, they were a performance of dominance, a way for Monroe to prove that he could break a man without breaking a sweat. To West, each insult was a fracture, a crack in the foundation of his spirit, threatening to shatter under the weight of relentless degradation. Yet, within West, a storm was building. His silence, mistaken by Monroe as surrender, was a dam holding back a torrent of rage. Every lash, every jeer, every public humiliation added pressure to that dam, each one a spark in a growing inferno. West learned to bury his anger deep, to let it simmer beneath a mask of obedience that kept him alive. But survival came at a cost. Each night, as he lay in the cold cabin, the echoes of Monroe's laughter replayed in his mind, a bitter refrain that burned his throat. He saw himself in those moments of humiliation, standing still while the world laughed, and he hated the man it forced him to be. But beneath that hatred was something else, a resolve, sharp and unyielding, that refused to let his humanity be erased. West's silence was not weakness, it was a strategic patience, a waiting game played in the shadows of a world that offered no mercy. With every insult, every blow, the pressure within him grew, a force that could not be contained forever. In the quiet of those Arkansas nights, West Bogan was not just enduring, he was preparing. his scars and silence forging a man who would soon demand to be heard. In the winter of 1863, as the Civil War raged across a divided nation, whispers of change crept into the Mississippi Delta like smoke slipping under a door. On Monroe Bowen's plantation in Phillips County, Arkansas, where the cotton fields lay under a frostbitten dawn, the air carried more than the chill of December. It carried rumors of freedom. Word of President Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, signed in January, had begun to spread, passed in hushed tones from one enslaved person to another. For Wes Bogan, a man whose life was bound by the chains of slavery, these whispers were both a lifeline and a torment. Late one night, as the cabin stood silent under a pale moon, the news reached him. A neighbor, voice barely above a breath, spoke the words that felt like thunder. "Lincoln says we're free?" The phrase hung in the air, fragile as a candle flame in a storm. Some in the room laughed nervously, their disbelief a shield against hope too dangerous to hold. Others wept quietly, their tears a mix of longing and fear. For Wes, those words were a spark, igniting a fire that had long smoldered beneath the weight of his suffering. Freedom, a concept so distant it felt like a myth, was suddenly real, written on paper somewhere far beyond the plantation's grasp. Yet, the dawn brought no liberty. The sun rose over the same fields, the same whips cracked, and Monroe Bowen's boots still echoed on the porch with the same cruel rhythm. In Arkansas, deep in Confederate territory, the Emancipation Proclamation was a distant promise, its power diluted by the stubborn grip of slavery. West felt the weight of this contradiction like a stone in his chest. The whispers of freedom were a cruel paradox. Hope dangled before him, yet every day began with the same commands, the same humiliations. Monroe's voice still cut through the air, mocking West as beast or mule, his laughter a reminder that no paper from Washington could undo the chains that bound him here. The fields stretched as far as the eye could see, their white cotton a symbol of the wealth built on his back, and the reality of his life remained unchanged. Each insult, each blow, now carried a new sting. If freedom was his by right, then every act of cruelty was not just pain but theft. The hope of liberty clashed with the despair of his reality, tearing at the fragile walls of patience he had built over years of endurance. In the quiet of the night, when the plantation slept and the stars offered a fleeting glimpse of something beyond the fields, Wes wrestled with this inner turmoil. He lay awake, the words, "We are free," echoing in his mind like a prayer he wasn't sure he believed. The cabins, cold and drafty, were filled with the soft murmurs of others who dared to dream aloud. They spoke of walking away, of fields without overseers, of a dawn where their songs were not of sorrow but of joy. But these dreams were dangerous. To speak of freedom was to risk the whip, the chain, or worse. Wes listened, his heart heavy with the weight of possibility and peril. The proclamation had changed something within him, not the world around him, but the way he saw it. Every lash, every jeer from Monroe, was no longer just a mark of oppression. It was a violation of a right he now knew he possessed. This knowledge was both a comfort and a torment, a flame that warmed his spirit but burned his restraint. West's resolve began to shift, like a river carving a new path through stone. For years, his silence had been his shield, a way to survive the relentless cruelty of the plantation. But now, with the whispers of freedom ringing in his ears, that silence felt less like protection and more like a cage. He began to see his endurance not as submission but as preparation, a gathering of strength for a moment he could feel approaching. The fire within him, once buried deep, grew hotter with every passing day. He no longer asked if freedom would come, he asked when, and what he would do when it did. In the shadows of the cabins, where hope and fear mingled like smoke, West's thoughts turned from patience to purpose. He was no longer just a man enduring, he was a man waiting, his scars and silence forging a resolve that was ready to break free. The whispers of freedom had planted a seed, and though the fields remained unchanged, Wes Bogan was not. He was preparing, his heart and mind aligning for a moment when the weight of his chains would demand action. The night before December 15, 1863, wrapped Phillips County in a bitter chill, the wind whispering through the cracks of the slave cabins like ghosts unwilling to rest. West Bogan sat by the dying embers of his hearth, his calloused hands resting on his knees, his mind a whirlwind of memories that refused to fade. The day had been like so many others, marked by Monroe Bowen's relentless cruelty. Earlier, in the dusty yard under a gray sky, Monroe had summoned West with a snap of his fingers, his voice booming across the plantation. "Get over here, you worthless mule!" He'd snarled, his polished boots kicking up dirt as he stepped closer. West had approached, his eyes fixed on the ground, but Monroe wasn't satisfied with silence. He delivered a sharp slap across West's face, the sting echoing louder than the blow itself, followed by a mocking grin that twisted like a knife. "That's all you're good for, taking what I give." Monroe laughed, his voice carrying to the gathered workers, drawing uneasy chuckles from those too afraid to look away. The humiliation burned deeper than any lash, a public stripping of dignity that left West feeling like a vessel cracked beyond repair. It wasn't the first time, but in that moment, with whispers of freedom still echoing in his ears from Lincoln's proclamation, it felt like the last. As the embers faded to ash, West rose and stepped into the biting air, the frost crunching beneath his bare feet like fragile glass. The moon hung low, casting a pale glow over the cotton fields that stretched endlessly into the darkness. His eyes fell on the chopping block near the cabin door, where the axe from the day's labor stood embedded in wood, its blade catching the faint light like a promise. West wrapped his hands around the handle, feeling its worn smoothness, the weight familiar from years of toil. But tonight, it felt different, not a tool for survival, but a means to reclaim what had been stolen. The slap from earlier replayed in his mind, Monroe's laughter a bitter refrain that fueled the fire within him. Years of scars, of being called beast and filth, of public mockery that reduced him to nothing, these were no longer just wounds. They were a call to action. West lifted the axe, testing its balance, then set it down, his breath fogging in the cold. Sleep eluded him that night. He sat with the axe beside him, staring into the void, his thoughts converging on a single truth: enough was enough. The whispers of freedom had planted a seed, and Monroe's final insult had watered it into something unbreakable. West was no longer enduring, he was deciding, his patience fracturing under the weight of a lifetime's injustice. Dawn crept over the horizon with an icy light, the fields blanketed in frost that glittered like shattered dreams. The plantation stirred with the muted sounds of another day, shuffling feet, coughs muffled by thin walls, the resigned rhythm of toil about to begin. For West, this morning carried a different weight. His grip tightened on the axe as he moved toward Monroe's house, his heart pounding like a war drum in his chest. Monroe stepped out onto the porch as he always did, wrapped in a coat against the cold, expecting the world to bend to his will. His boots struck the wood with that familiar thud, a sound that once spelled dread but now rang hollow in West's ears. The air was sharp, each breath turning to mist, time seeming to slow as West approached. Monroe's eyes narrowed, perhaps sensing something amiss, but arrogance blinded him. "What are you staring at, boy?" he barked, his voice laced with the same contempt that had broken so many before. But West was done breaking. The axe rose in his scarred hands, arms forged by years of labor swinging with a force born of desperation and defiance. The silence shattered not with screams but with the thud of wood meeting flesh, history tearing open in a single, swift motion. Monroe staggered, shock etching his face for the first time, the master who had wielded power like a crown now facing its collapse. It wasn't a prolonged fight, no dramatic struggle under the rising sun, just a decisive strike against every humiliation, every lash, every stolen year. West stood there, chest heaving, the axe heavy in his grip as Monroe crumpled to the ground. The frost still glistened, the cotton rows still stretched toward the horizon, but the world had shifted irrevocably. In that moment, West felt no triumph, no rush of victory, only a profound release, the weight of silence lifted from his shoulders. His pulse thundered in his ears, a defiant rhythm that proclaimed he was no longer property, no longer a shadow. He was a man who had acted, who had reclaimed his dignity in a system designed to deny it. The dawn continued to brighten, illuminating a truth that could never be undone. West Bogan had broken his chains, if only in spirit, and the silence he shattered would echo far beyond that frosty morning. The dawn of December 15, 1863, broke with a scream that rippled through Phillips County, Arkansas, leaving a community fractured. West Bogan's axe had silenced Monroe Bowen, and the news spread like wildfire, igniting fury among the white planters who saw his act as a dangerous spark of rebellion. Their shouts filled the air, demanding swift justice to preserve their crumbling order, their fear palpable as they armed riders for the hunt. In the shadowed cabins, whispers carried a different tone, quiet awe for a man who dared to strike back. West, knowing escape was futile, stood his ground as the militia closed in, their dogs baying through the frosty fields. Bound and led to jail, he walked with a dignity that unnerved his captors, his silence louder than their rage. The trial was a formality, a packed courthouse where no voice spoke for West. The judge's gavel fell, sentencing him to hang, a warning to others who might dream of defiance. Yet, West's act endured beyond the gallows. To the enslaved, he became a symbol, his name whispered as a testament to the unbreakable human spirit. His story asked us, what is justice when a man must die to claim his humanity? Reflect on West's courage, and subscribe to our YouTube channel to explore more untold stories of resilience. Share your thoughts below. Let's keep this history alive.